I've had a few people ask if I can do a video breaking down the Bulls lottery odds for the draft lottery, which is coming up on Sunday the 12th. Of course, they had to do it on Mother's Day, not ideal NBA when I've got a wife and a mother who are big on this holiday, but I digress. But the draft lottery is coming up shortly, and because the Bulls failed to make the playoffs, they will be a lottery team. And unlike last year, they actually have their pick this season and won't be sending it to the Orlando Magic. So in this video, we'll break down where the Bulls are most likely to land in the lottery, the odds of moving up into the top 4, and then also what it would mean for the Bulls and their offseason should they land a top lottery pick in this year's draft. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Apologies that the content has been a bit sparse lately. Life has been pretty busy at the moment with my work and kids. I've also been laser focused on content for the second channel given we're in the middle of the playoffs. Feel free to check out my second channel, by the way, if you haven't already. If you like NBA content in general, it's called And1 Hoops, and let me know what you think of it. But as the offseason starts ramping up with the decisions on player options, free agency for DeMar DeRozan, Patrick Williams, the eventual draft in late June, all that good stuff, I'll obviously start posting more. Right now, we're just in kind of this weird waiting game. Like, the Bulls aren't going to be making any moves until after they see how things shake out in the playoffs and see which teams get desperate and may want to make a play for Zach Lavine. Maybe even see what a potential sign and trade would look like for DeMar, or extend him before he becomes a free agent, depending on the landscape of the market after the draft. So we're kind of in this holding pattern to see what the future holds for the Bulls roster while the playoffs are in high gear. But one thing we do know, and we'll know in just a matter of a few days, is what pick the Bulls are going to have in this year's upcoming draft. Now, I'm sure most of you already know this, but I always like to explain it for new fans to the NBA, or maybe those that just don't quite understand how the lottery works, which is completely understandable because it is very confusing. But the way it works is unlike some sports like the NFL, where the worst team in the league gets the number 1 pick and the second worst team gets the number 2 pick and so on, to minimize teams outright tanking and trying to be bad so they can secure the number 1 pick, the NBA implemented a draft lottery back in 1985. Now, obviously, the rules and odds of the lottery have changed over time, but the gist of it is the 14 teams that did not make the playoffs are put into a lottery system for a chance at moving up into the top 4. It used to be the top 3, but they have since moved it to 4, and they've also flattened out the lottery odds. So essentially, even if you finish with the best record among all the non-playoff teams, you have a shot at landing the number 1 pick. The odds are very small, which I'll show the odds in a minute, but the 14th worst team in the NBA could, in theory, get the number 1 pick or at least move into the top 4. The worst team in the league is by no means guaranteed that number 1 pick. In fact, the 3 worst teams in the NBA all have the same odds of landing the number 1 pick, which I'll put up the graphic now breaking down the odds. I know you're going to say, well, what do you mean? The Pistons and the Wizards have the same odds for those first 4 picks, but not the Hornets. Well, that's because the Blazers and the Hornets finished with the same record, so they had to implement a tiebreak between the odds for that 3rd position, decreasing the Hornets' odds just slightly below that of the Pistons and the Wizards. But the bottom line is this is how the percentages break down by all the lottery teams. By the way, the red indicates a pick that would be traded if it fell on that given selection, as certain teams have protections on their picks that they've made in prior trades. Now, let's look at the Bulls here. The Bulls finished with the 11th worst record in the NBA. Oddly enough, they finished in the exact same spot last season. And while they could have moved up into the top 4 and got to keep their pick as it was top 4 protected, it did not move up, and thus their pick conveyed to the Orlando Magic as the number 11 pick. Now, here is what might confuse some people as to why there are a bunch of missing percentages on all of these quadrants. If it's a blank space, it means that that team has a 0% chance of falling in that range. And for the Bulls, the reason why they will not land somewhere between 5 and 10 is because the draft lottery, the drawing of the ping pong balls, is only for the rights to move up into the top 4. It's not a lottery pick for all of 1 through 14. And so every team is vying for a chance at moving into the top 4. As you can see, the better your record was, the lower your odds are in getting a top 4 pick. The Bulls, they have a 9.4% chance of landing in the top 4, and you can see the percentages of each pick if they move up. 2% chance to get the number 1 selection, and then the percentages get slightly better with the number 2, 3, and number 4 pick. Now you're probably asking, why are there odds for getting the 12th pick and beyond? So the only way the Bulls could fall back from the 11th pick is if one or more of the teams behind them jump into the top 4. In those instances where a team does jump into the top 4, all the teams behind them would drop back 1 pick. So if the Rockets, Kings, or Warriors move up into the top 4, the Bulls would get the 12th pick, the Hawks would get the 11th pick, the Nets the 10th, and so on. I'll do a simulation of what it would look like in an instance of a team moving up into the top 4 using the Tankathon's draft lottery simulator. So in this scenario, we actually had a lot of teams jump up into the top 4. The Jazz somehow got the number 1 pick, moving up 7 spots where they were at least expected to land initially. The Spurs and Raptors also moved up into the top 4, and then the Blazers got the last pick in the lottery drawing, which is where they were expected to land. Thus, you can see all the teams that were ahead of them got pushed back in the draft. The Pistons, who had the worst record, got pushed all the way to number 5, with 4 teams jumping them. Same with the Wizards and the Hornets, and then the Grizzlies fell by just 1 spot because only the Jazz were behind them in the standings. Any team beyond 8th were not impacted because the highest winning team that moved up into the top 4 in this case was the Utah Jazz. So anyway, I know it's kind of a lot, but in short, the Bulls have the highest odds of landing with the number 11 pick at 77.6%, 9.4% chance of landing in the top 4, 12.6% that they could actually fall back to number 12, and then very, very unlikely that they fall to either 13th or 14th. Now let's talk about what it would mean for the Bulls if they get lucky and move into the top 4. Unlikely, but at just 9%, it's not out of the realm of possibility. Although watch, they'll move up in this year's draft instead of last year when it was a historically good draft class, while they had a protected pick, and now they obviously have their pick in one of the weaker draft classes in recent memory. But if the Bulls move up into the top 4, let's say even getting the number 1 pick, it does change a lot for them in terms of how it will dictate the rest of their offseason. First and foremost, before discussing the potential talent impact, getting the number 1 pick, or even the number 4 pick for that matter, has huge cap sheet implications for the Bulls. We've talked about it before, but with the impending free agencies of both DeMar and Patrick Williams, even giving them the most conservative estimates of Patrick taking the qualifying offer at $12.9 million, DeMar getting somewhere around $30 million, which some suspect that he could get as much as $40 million, but at those rates, the Bulls are already well over the luxury tax, and that still leaves empty roster spots for Drummond and Javonte Green, assuming they leave in free agency. The current salary the Bulls have committed going into next season is $141 million, which is based on the cap hold for the number 11 pick at around $7 million. The number 1 pick is going to get you more than that, much more than that. It's going to be closer to $13 million for their first year salary. And when you're already at $141 million, and that does not include potential extensions for DeMar and Patrick Williams, and now you have to add an additional $6 million cap hold when you're already pressed right up against the tax line, if not over already, that's a significant impact as it relates to the kind of salary they're going to be able to sign DeMar and Patrick to, which will impact negotiations with both of them in free agency. And because the Bulls are constrained by the luxury tax and not exceeding that line, it could have an impact on how much they use their mid-level exception. That said, maybe it's a good problem to have. Like, yes, the Bulls don't have the additional money to really add to their payroll, but getting the number 1 pick compared to the 11th pick is not the worst thing in the world, and you would hope the Bulls would figure it out and prioritize getting a bone thrown their way and getting a top prospect versus focusing on paying DeMar on a big extension. But the other thing that landing in the top 4 could potentially impact the Bulls and their offseason is they could use that pick as a trade chip. They wouldn't be able to trade the pick until draft night, as the Bulls owe their pick to the Spurs next year, and you can't trade consecutive first-round picks in the NBA. But once the selection has been made, you can move that pick. Now, do I think the Bulls will actually trade the pick if they get lucky and get into the top 4? No, mainly because the Bulls haven't made any trades with the exception of trading for the rights of Julian Phillips since the 2021 offseason, but also the Bulls have to start thinking about their future. You can't get lucky in the lottery when you have such few ways out of this hole that you've dug yourself in to just trade that pick to try and get a more established player. Now, I wouldn't be shocked either if they actually end up moving it, because we know this front office still wants to remain competitive, and rather than bringing in a project player that will take some time to develop, they may try and package that pick to entice some team to move on from one of their veterans. It's also possible the Bulls could look to do that anyway with the 11th pick, trying to move it in a trade or package it in some kind of deal. I honestly don't know. They said they want to enact change. The time for change is now. Maybe they get aggressive in selling off an asset like this year's lottery pick. Who knows? Now, if the Bulls land in the top 4 and keep the pick, from a talent perspective and how the Bulls shape out the rest of their roster, I don't think it's going to impact their offseason all that much, just purely from a talent standpoint. Yeah, you're going to be more likely to hit on a great player if it's in the top 4 than you would at number 11, but because this draft is not stacked, it's likely going to be one of those drafts in which you really have to find diamonds in the rough. As in, you're just as likely to find gems in the late lottery or mid-first round as you could potentially be in the top 4. What I will say though is if the Bulls get into the top 4, it's probably going to be more of a scenario where you draft the best player available when drafting that high, and then you can move on from them after the fact if the fit is not there. Whereas if they have the 11th pick, they absolutely need to prioritize positional need. They need size, interior defense, floor spacing. A big that can shoot is ideal. No more guards. The last thing the Bulls need is another guard. And while this draft class isn't deep, there are actually a lot of bigs that are projected to go in the lottery at around that 11th spot. Cody Williams, Matas Buzelis, I think that's how you pronounce his name. There are a bunch of also bigs coming out of France that look promising. So they are going to have options to add solid rotational players that fit a need on the team. You're likely not going to find a star level player in this draft, but solid young talent that you can work with. Now, I have not put out a draft prospects video yet for some of the options for the Bulls because I'm waiting to see what pick they'll ultimately get once the draft lottery has been done, but I'll have something out leading up to the draft as we get more information on some of these prospects and get a chance to see them at the draft combine. So stay tuned for that. In the meantime, let me know what you guys think and if this was helpful at all in explaining the NBA draft process. As always, be sure to subscribe and I will see you in the next one.